looking at this board, you can see I have the word life written here. Consider that our brain is our primary tool in terms of how we manage our life. And one thing we know about life is stuff will always be coming in and going out. If air isn't coming in, there's a problem. Air comes in, air goes out. So life really does indicate that there's an exchange process. And one thing we also realize is we're not in control of the majority of the things that come in and out of our lives. And there's times when something comes in or goes out, whether it's wanted or unwanted, wanted doesn't matter, it will trigger that danger center in our brain. When that gets triggered, we go to a stress response. Now, in the context of the rattlesnake, that stress response puts us in a place of fight, flight, or freeze. We live through it, we go past it, and once again, we're now enjoying our hike or our experience. We're back to a state of, this is fine, this works, this is good. That's how the stress response is supposed to work in our lives. The danger, the threat is supposed to show up, then it goes away, and we're fine. We've used the increased muscle tension, the increased mental focus, we've used the adrenaline to help us deal with that situation, and then the situation's over and we return to a sense of calm and normalcy. Well, so many of the things that we deal with as parents, we deal with as employees, we deal with people in life, we get in the stress response and we get caught in a place of fight, flight, or freeze. And it's not something that goes away quickly. It's not something that we can manage. And suddenly we get caught in what I like to refer to as a toxic loop. There is no doubt about the toxicity of the stress response. It impacts our physical health. It actually is corrosive to our body and our brain. The neurochemicals are not designed to be there very often. So if they're there a lot, it compromises our immune system. It impacts the memory centers of the brain. Somewhere between 70 and 90% of your trips to a physician will be caused by the toxicity of the stress response. So this is a huge thing in our lives. Now, the reality of being caught in this toxic loop is it continues to become more and more painful. So the person who's struggling with financial issues, or issues with children, issues with employment, issues with their neighbor's dog, whatever it is that seems to be triggering them, it doesn't really matter. Fight, flight, or freeze becomes this loop. And as the longer we stay in this loop, the more pain, the more dysfunction, the more struggle we're experiencing. Now, one of the most destructive elements of this toxic loop occurs when, in the process of the pain we're experiencing, we want to find some kind of relief. We want to feel better. We want to feel different. We don't want to feel the pain, but yet when we fought it, we lose. When we run from it, it follows us. And when we're frozen, we're just waiting to die. In other words, we are in trouble. We don't see a way out of this toxic loop. This is where escape becomes the thing that all of us have figured out in one way or another. Now, the famous escapes fall into the drugs, alcohol, sex, food, and gambling. And you can look at these as chemical addictions, such as drugs and alcohol. This is an external chemical that's being introduced. When you start talking about food, sex, and gambling, you're talking about an internal chemical response. There is no doubt about how inside our own heads there's a pharmacy. And the neurochemicals of adrenaline, the dopamine, these kinds of things, they can really get the brain fired up. And so we recognize that there's addictive potential for things that are external to us, as well as to the neurochemicals of our own mind. And not only can we be addicted to something like food or alcohol, but we can also have a whole series of secondary addictions that are more of an emotional addiction, such as control. Something has happened, there's a loss of control, they're stressing out. Now a person's fighting for control. They've fought for control, they've gained control, and what do they feel? They feel better temporarily. And that's how control can become an addiction. Resentment is seen as the #1 killer of alcoholics. You might have thought it would be alcohol. But see, something happens to them, they create a huge resentment, they're stressing out. Can they resolve this resentment? No. Whether they fight, whether they try to avoid it, whether they run from it, that resentment is still there, it's still very painful, and they discover there's a way to act out, which causes more resentment, justifying the acting out. But when a person is in a state of resentment, they blame or project everything onto that person, that whatever they're resenting, and then they have a sense of resolution or they're absolved from their part of the story or situation, and they feel better temporarily. So recognizing that we can have internal chemical addiction, external chemical addiction, as well as emotionals is part of the challenge of recognizing this escape route. Now the challenge here is to recognize that this just becomes more painful and more toxic. And the question of recognizing what we can do to face, to actually intentionally take on facing the stress, facing the concerns, and using a whole variety of tools to deactivate the stress response, help us shift into a more effective mental state to begin to process and move things forward. That's what I like to refer to as this toxic loop, as it relates to so many of the things in our lives as far as addiction, avoidance, and the challenge is how do we face things. Now, only when we can deactivate that midbrain can we actually be in a place where we can start to make the choices, take the actions, figure out what next right step is going to work. Now, one of the tools I've been experimenting with and having a lot of fun with, if we can kind of pan over to here, this is a nose. There's a whole question of aromatherapy. Now, we know that the olfactory bulb, the part of the brain that's responsible for smelling, is right next, it's like right here. Now, an essential oil that I'll often use with addicts is wild orange. If they'll put a couple drops on their hand and smell that, I've never yet met anybody who doesn't go, "Oh, that smells good." Well, that starts to ping the pleasure center in a different kind of way. It also disrupts the thought processes, and it can disrupt the emotion that's going on, and then they can start to move from here to that frontal cortex again and saying, what's my next right step? Maybe I need to call somebody in my recovery program so I can explain why I'm so agitated and work through that rather than just getting lost and being agitated, getting caught in this toxic loop, wanting to escape, go through the relapse cycle once again.
As wives and mothers, I think it's really important that women typically are the caregivers or the nurturers in the home. Not that we want it to stay that way. I love the fact that many men are getting interested in the healer's touch method.
Don't exclude the fathers.
And it's so important. I just had a session with a man today who our session was, and he said I'm able to share. He said I can even use his name. But we talked about his relationship with his daughter and how daddies can sometimes be this father bear influence in a daughter's life. And they just want to protect. They want to preside, protect, and provide. And sometimes a daughter doesn't necessarily understand that when my father is doing this for me, it's because he loves me. So I was able to share with this man how when he comes across angry, the daughter may not be interpreting his anger as love.
Pretty hard to interpret anger as love.
She may be interpreting his anger as hate or I'm not good enough. And I told him that I'm writing a book right now called The Glass Slipper and how every little daughter first had as her first Prince Charming her dad. And every father held out the glass slipper. And if we didn't feel like our foot fit, then we would go in search of another prince. A prince where he would hold out the glass slipper. And if our foot fit in his glass slipper, we'd stay and live happily ever after. And so we're talking about that. And the whole goal is to how can we create a joyful heart? How can we raise the vibration to joy? As wives, as mothers, as men, as fathers, as husbands, our joy is constantly being interrupted with pop quizzes. How many times have we started our day with our affirmation, our prayer, our scripture, and our motivational self-talk, and we're going to have a great day, it's going to be blissful. And then boom, we get that phone call, or boom, something else happens and interrupts our joy. The goal is then, how do I not go into my midbrain, go into fight, flight, or freeze, get triggered up by old experiences of the past, and then go into the old habitual ways of dealing with stress. What I'm doing in my personal life and what I'm really working on, and after hearing this presentation by him, I'm ready to hire him for the rest of my life. But as I'm working through this in my life, I realized that my goal is to live in a more conscious, joyful state. And I have to share something here that is very, very, I think it'll be fascinating to you too. So the other night, I have been waking in the night because I have a little grandson that has bad dreams in the night. Maybe they're night terrors. He hasn't been diagnosed with that, but he's right under my heater vent. And his mother has been listening to some psychologist that says you just need to let your children cry it out. So she lets him cry. But in my history with my children, I never let them cry through the night. The minute I heard a peep, I was up, rocking that baby and singing him lullabies back to sleep. So now we have a difference in mothering. And so little Kalai wakes up in the night. I wake up in the night, and it triggers me back to when I was married to my first husband, and when Michael used to wake up in the night with big bad dreams in the middle of the night. And my husband would start to yell, Michael, go back to sleep. Michael, go back to sleep. And I would have heart palpitations. Oh no, he's going to get mad at Michael, and I don't want Michael to get in trouble. So I would dive out of bed at the first peep. The first sound of Michael's awakening, I would go grab my baby, rock him back to sleep, and sing him lullabies. So years had passed. Michael was 15. Michael got in trouble. Michael would sneak out at night, and I would be awakened in the night by bang, 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 bang on the door. Policeman at the door. Is this your son? Sometimes I didn't want to claim him, but I did. And then there was a night where I was sleeping soundly, having the sweetest dream, and I awakened to my name being whispered, and there was my friend, and my friend actually had come into my house and told me, your son's in the emergency room. He's been beat up with brass knuckles, and he's going to have his eye operated on. And I remember heart palpitations, cold sweats, getting in that car and feeling like, oh no, the world's coming down. There's nothing worse than a rude awakening in the middle of the night, you know?
Well, again, you talk about the most serious kinds of triggers, the things that parents were most afraid of. All those things have been programmed in that brain of ours as this is dangerous, this is scary, and we have an instant, uncontrollable response. I think one of the most important things to recognize, Karyn, is we will never train the stress response to go away. That's not the goal.
You need to learn to deal with it, right?
Well, we've got to recognize that when we get triggered, and this is, I actually like to use the word activated. I teach a musician to recognize this system in their body has now been activated. It's not anxiety, it's not stress, it's not terrible, it's not horrible. They're now activated.
That's great.
And so in the sense of being activated, the question is, what can you learn, what can you do to deactivate? And how do you get that calm sense returned?
Exactly.
And it takes somewhere between 20 to 40 minutes sometimes for all those neurochemicals to get burned out of the system. So it's not like you're going to flip a switch on and then flip it off.
Right.
You're going to have to learn how to practice doing
So
it.
practicing joy is now my new thing. Practicing joy and in that process, realizing that when I wake up in the night to the sound of Kalai's crying, and I feel those same feelings of apprehension and anxiety that I felt when Michael was a little 3-year-old, or when Michael was a 15-year-old and the police came knocking, I'm realizing that Kalai's cry is only a trigger for something that never really peacefully got resolved. And so, as I woke up the other night, I started to pray, and I said, you know, my whole work now, my whole life's mission is to help people to create a joyful heart, a joyful mind, and to be able to move quickly. How can we expedite that process? The healer's touch method is a method that Dr. Skidmore is aware of. He's experienced it. But this uses all 5 senses of the brain, all 5 senses that are all located in their response ability, the ability to respond to the sense of smell, the sense of taste, the sense of touch, the sense of hearing, and the sense of sight. And so what I would like to ask you is, when somebody brings to me their child or their husband or their sister, and this person is having a problem with toxic loop, they're having a problem with first response, they're having a problem with living in the midbrain more often than not, all I knew was that it worked. I didn't know why it worked. I just knew When somebody lay down on the massage table and had Christ-centered music and had oils and had therapeutic touch that was releasing oxytocin as we just simply stroke their arm, is shifting chemistries in the body. And I would love for you to explain scientifically why using all 5 senses is better than using just 1 sense or 2 senses. How using them all creates a place of placidity in the brain.